We are going to move into part 2, which is all about social justice and why we should be asking big questions for and with our little people. The first speaker on this topic is Reilley Beck, and they will be speaking on the topic of LGBTQ plus inclusion. And I will not be interrupting Caitlin with my voice, but I will give them I'll give her a little note in the chat. So thank you so much, Caitlin. I invite you to be our next presenter.
Thanks so much, Leanne. So let me start with a story. When my godchild Nathan was 3, he was doing lots of the things that 3-year-olds do. He liked to be a cat on most days. He rode around on his scooter. He made up songs and played instruments, and he was learning about language, and in particular, how we talk about people using pronouns. One day when I was visiting his house, I heard him talking to his parents about me. I knew he was talking about me because he was telling them all the fun things that we did together that day while I was babysitting him. But in the telling of his story, he had used not just she, her pronouns for me, but also he, him. This was the first time that I had heard someone use he, him pronouns for me, and I was surprised to discover that it felt really good. But so did hearing him use she, her at the same time. It actually felt like Nathan had seen something true about me that most other people didn't, and that I hadn't discovered myself yet. It was after this that I began using multiple pronouns to refer to myself. Just as Jesus was fully God incarnate, even as a wordless infant, each of us is a full human person before we can speak or write or otherwise communicate to others about who we are. Children are not empty vessels or blank slates that we need to fill for them to be something. They are already beings, already bearing the image and likeness of God. And they interact with us and the world around them. And in so doing, there is revelation that happens. Revelation of them to us to them, and so much about the world and about God in the process. There are a few things I hear regularly from people leading children's ministries about the inclusion of LGBTQIA2S+ content. Number 1, they're just kids. They don't need to learn about sex yet, so they won't understand this content. Number 2, we're just a small ministry or church. We can't do everything. There's no time or money for this content. We don't have any queer or trans kids or families in our congregation, so we haven't included this content. And lastly, we know that LGBTQIA2S+ content is important. We're an affirming church, but we don't know how to do it well. And we are afraid we are going to make mistakes. The first 3 of these reasons see queer and trans content as an add-on, an extra, rather than the core and the heart of things. In the case of congregations that don't have any queer or trans kids or families, this shows that you've successfully communicated to the queer and trans people in the world that you think we are just an add-on. Also, I'm willing to bet money that you do have queer and trans people in your congregation, but you might not for long, or you might never know it. Gender and sexuality aren't parts of our lives that only exist behind closed bedroom doors. Gender and sexuality are about understanding ourselves, learning and knowing about human bodies, the way families and relationships work. These things are central to kids' lives from the very beginning. From the age of about 2, kids can sort people into categories, including by gender. In fact, sorting is one of the things they are best at this age. As they get older at 3 and 4, they work at sorting themselves into the categories they've learned and seeing where they fit. In addition to knowing and claiming their own gender identities, this is a moment in their moral development when they are looking to see what is allowed or preferred or rewarded. And they are able to see and understand when some things are only allowed or preferred or rewarded or punished for certain people. They are figuring out both what they like, what toys or clothes or food or characters or stories, and then, is it okay or not? One of the ways that kids learn best what is okay is from stories. And the church has lots of stories to tell. Some of these stories are in the Bible. Some are in our liturgy. Some are in the sermons or children's sermons that we tell. But some of these stories are also in the art that we use in the sanctuary, or which kids' artwork we put up on the bulletin board, or which kid's comment gets the most laughs from the congregation, or what we say to kids about the clothes that they're wearing. Some of these stories are buried in our archives. Some of these stories have been left out of our history books, and some are only told in whispers. And once again, gender and sexuality show up here too. LGBTQIA2S+ content isn't just extra if you have time content, because gender and sexuality, family structure, human relationships, these are central to many of the stories of our faith. What are we missing from the stories of the disciples of the Last Supper if queer notions of chosen family aren't taught to kids? What are we missing from the story of the Nativity if only one kind of family, only one way of bringing kids into the world is ever explained to kids? What are we missing from the story of our own baptism if God's love is conditional on having an acceptable gender identity or sexual orientation or family structure? I'll give you a more specific example of what we were missing with another story. This is a story of a boy and his family. A boy whose father loved him in a special way because he could see himself in him. To honor this, the father gave the boy a ketonet pasim, a beautiful princess dress. It was a richly ornamented, beautiful long sleeve dress. The boy loved it and wore it every day, and he would show it off to his brothers who didn't get a ketonet pasim from their father and explain why it showed that he was extra special. Well, as you can imagine, things took a hard and violent turn for this boy. His brothers decided to punish him for who he was and what he liked. They beat him up and cast him out of the family. They took his beloved ketonet pasim and tore it up and covered it in blood and gave it back to their father so that he believed that his beloved son was dead. Now, the Bible translates ketonet pasim in many different ways in different versions, but you might know it as a technicolor dream coat. The only other place that this term is used in scripture is in 2 Samuel to describe the kind of dress worn by Tamar, the daughter of King David. But if you don't know about queerness and transness, if you want to deny and punish their existence, then you might not see this in the story, or you might leave it out. In many cases, we have inherited a tradition that has hidden, erased, slandered, and denied queer and trans people. And so we have been missing parts of our stories and parts of our communities. Children and their genders and their relationships are part of finding these missing pieces of our story because they reveal truths that society has tried to hide, but kids don't know that yet. One of the most beautiful things about how being a person works is that not all people are the same age at the same time. To me, it feels like one way to carry my whole life with me at the time, all the time. When I spend time with kids, I can remember back to when I was their age. And when I spend time with elders, I can picture myself growing old and imagine what that might be like. We need people in different ages and stages of life because we can help each other and care for each other in ways unique to that stage. This is one of the main gifts of human families and communities, and I think it's one of the main gifts of the church. God is in relationship with people of all ages, and it is in caring for, learning about, listening to one another in all of our differences that we learn about a God who created each of us in their image and likeness. We share our tradition, our liturgy, our stories, and ultimately ourselves with children so that they can know, like we do, that they are created by this God in this image, so that they can look for God in each other, in themselves, and in the world around them, so that they can follow in the pattern of God set forth in Jesus's life of putting those from the margins in the center of a caring community. But we can't care well for kids. We can't care for anyone well if we aren't willing to listen to them and know them. Now, back to those refrains I hear about the inclusion of LGBTQIA2S+ content in children's ministry, in particular that last one. We know this content is important, but we don't know how to do it well, and we're afraid we're going to make mistakes. Don't worry. We definitely are going to make mistakes. In fact, we have definitely already made mistakes. but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We don't need to know everything in order to start, just the opposite. We need to be prepared to learn that we don't know something, or that what we once learned is wrong. We need to listen. Listen to kids, listen to queer people, listen to trans people about their lives and experiences and about the world. Because queer and trans people were all kids once, and God created each of those kids to reveal something of who God is, and maybe, if you are lucky, to reveal something about who you are.
Thank you so very much, Caitlin. And welcome to Edward, one of the chairs of the Anti-Racism Task Force of the Diocese of Montreal.
Thank you. How do we teach kids about Christianity? And where does social justice fit in? It's been summarized. Love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. This is active. It requires doing things. Sentimentality has been defined as love without a sense of justice, and that's not Christian love. There's no dichotomy between spirituality and social justice. And Jesus made that very clear in every word that he uttered and every teaching that he made. But there is a huge contrast between the spirituality of doing nothing and the spirituality of doing something. Race is one of those touchy subjects that you don't want to get into because you're afraid you might mess it up, and that's understandable. I share that anxiety a lot. But the worst conversation you can have with kids about race is no conversation at all. And the time to shield children from racism is pretty much never. And if you're trying to keep kids innocent of systemic racism, there's a 99.999% chance that you're white. Children of color are not afforded that same luxury, which brings me to my first big fat point. Talking about race needs to happen early, often, and honestly. There's only one race, the human race. This is a fact of both poetry and science. The World Health Organization has said as much, and it's very important for kids to understand that. It's all made up. The whole concept is made up. But it still matters. I mean, the whole concept of money is made up, but it really affects our lives. The whole economy is made up. There's a lot of crazy things that are made up, but they still have a huge effect on everything that we do. It's a bit like talking about sex, and Caitlin's talk made me think of this. It used to be you were given the talk once when you were a kid about sex. I was born in 1963, the April before Kennedy was shot the following November, and my dad gave me that talk in like second grade. He showed me a sperm and an egg, and I was none the wiser afterwards. I had no idea how anything happened. So it's an ongoing conversation. We now understand it at different ages, different stages of development, and it's the same as race. Speaking with my friend, the Reverend Debbie Noonan Zink, and the way she speaks to her 3-year-old is different from how she speaks to her 7-year-old. When the 3-year-old notices race, she's like, "Yes, this girl has brown skin and you have white skin. Isn't that beautiful? And people are different. Isn't that wonderful?" With her 7-year-old, she talks about facts of history and injustice and the importance of being allies with your friends of color. I wonder how many of the people listening here had parents who spoke to them in any aware way about race when they were kids. I mean, did your white parents speak to you about race? 50% of white families never speak to their kids about race, even one time. So this has to change, and it has to change inside the church, because the church has been complicit with the residential schools and with slavery, and we basically owe it to the world to try to turn things around. It's probably the same with LGBTQ and differently abled people. I mean, these are things that were just white people talking to their kids about race is a brand new thing in the history of the world. So yes, I know plenty of white 60-year-olds who are just now beginning to question the color of a Band-Aid for the first time in their lives. And we don't want to raise a generation to be in the same boat when they're 60 years old. We need a generation that's going to turn things around. If you take a look at the Anglican Diocesan webpage, the anti-racism group has a whole section on Sunday school and children. It has a lot of resources. We got children's Bibles with pictures of diversity, just wonderful resources to help kids along the way. And this brings me to my second point. Colorblind is not desirable. We don't want kids to say, oh, I'm colorblind and that's good enough. That helps perpetuate the system. Being different is great. This is the message. Diversity is a wonderful thing, especially if we're not treating people who are different as inferior. Kids understand this too. They love different foods, different colors. Who wants a box of Crayolas where every color is the same? Incidentally, when I was a kid, there was one crayon called Flesh Color. And that was phased out in 1962, but that was still around when I was a kid. I grew up in Western Maryland and my best friends were Black. And in the 70s, the Black people in my neighborhood walked differently than white people, and I walked like my Black friends, and I thought I was super cool. And I thought I was Bill Cosby performing his, greatest hits album. And at the school, we were taught very little about anything racially or about the Civil War. They told us that the Civil War had zero to do with slavery. It was all about states' rights. Boy, was that a lie. I was probably the youngest kid on record who read Alex Haley's Roots as a white kid, but I still understood zero about what my Black friends went through, what they feared, the things that they were subjected to in my town. I remember when I was in 5th grade, my best friend Chucky Powell and I watched Planet of the Apes. And the Black astronaut gets killed first when they're all running. And I remember that smirk on his face when he smiled and nodded. And I'll never forget it, just that cynical pain. And he's like, of course the Black guy gets killed first. And I remember this light going off in my head. Yeah, you're right. It's like a law of Hollywood. But it never occurred to me the pain or what my friends were feeling, And when I think about that, it still makes me sad. When I saw Star Wars, it never occurred to me, there's no Black people in the original Star Wars. And I wonder even if some of my friends gave it too much thought, because as Myrna Lashley points out, it's the ideology that's the enemy that we were all subjected to, that we were all brainwashed by. I was cheerfully oblivious to the horrors of American apartheid as I grew up.
1 minute warning, thank you.
Thank you. So kids are brave, and we have to be brave if we're going to deserve to be around them. And they understand about justice, they understand about kindness, they understand about standing up for each other. And of course, we're all going to make mistakes, but adults are going to be transformed. The world is going to be transformed. And we're going to have a world with a lot less bullying in it, where people are able to reach their own full potential. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will put the link to the website that has the links for children's ministry in the chat as well. Carrying on this topic of social justice, I would like to invite Bishop Mark MacDonald to deliver an Indigenous perspective. It's all yours, Mark.
Miigwech, thank you. I'm very happy to greet you this morning with God's peace, and to describe you all as relatives, and I'm hoping that we may live into that reality. Look, of course, the most stern and challenging statements that Jesus, some of the most stern and challenging statements that Jesus had to make were about children, and some of the most expansive promises that Jesus had to make were about children. If you look at the New Testament, even casually, you will see that this is one of the most urgent and pressing issues. It is amazing to me how many of our churches can shrug at the lack of children present. And I am speaking to you from Kamloops. Kamloops was where the remains of 215 children were found a few months ago. And if we needed a reminder of what Jesus had to say about the urgency of this matter, we have been given a very shocking and stern one. Children will be aware of what is going on, and I think that we have to understand children from a number of different perspectives, how they will react. Certainly, fear is going to touch all of them when they see these images of little shoes or other things that have been used to respond to these revelations. And there is absolutely no way that children are going to escape them. And I think every child, no matter what their cultural background, is going to see those with a certain amount of fear. If they are children who have been put into the common narrative of Canadian life, they will also feel some sense of disintegration. It has been my experience that we get invested in stories. We live in stories about what has happened and how we came to be here. And when we are presented with stories like the 215 children, when we are presented with images like the little shoes, we feel a sense of disintegration, and we try to grasp things that make us feel some sense of wholeness again. I think that the amazing acceptance of the land acknowledgements across the Canadian church and across Canadian society is an example of something very positive that we have done as a whole to try to reintegrate a sense of who we are, to try to repair the damage done to what sadly was a very racist narrative of Canadian life. And so I think that we have to understand that our children are being faced with that kind of shock and fear and disintegration. And so I think our task is to create a new kind of narrative, a narrative in which we have an inclusive and a just way of looking at our hope in common life. And I think absolutely you will see that this is so doable. It can begin with a land acknowledgement and explaining that to children as to what that means. I think it has to acknowledge something of what the something of what the breach of the radical breach of trust that was given to children, and how dangerous that is. And I think the repair of that, the protection against that, has to be also a part of the narrative of what we are building together as a people, as a whole. And finally, in this section, Elijah Harper, the great chief who stopped constitutional reform in its track, he always used to say that the founding vision of this land was that this land was so great that the original peoples could welcome people from all over, and that together we could become relatives, we could become tribe together, that we could create a life for our children and grandchildren that was better than the life we had separately. And I think his narrative, which is, as he correctly says, was the foundation of the treaties. The indigenous people who entered into the treaties did not feel that this was a ceding of land and authority. They saw it as a way of making family, of making relatives. And this vision of becoming relatives, of welcoming people from all over, but also of showing justice to those who have always been here, that this making of relatives is the foundation of our story. Now, with that new narrative, I would add one other thing, and that is to let them understand that they have agency in the establishment of that story, and that they have agency right now, that they can be a part of a reweaving of the story of who we are as a people. And I think that this is so necessary. About somewhere between 50 and 70% of indigenous people are under the age of 20. So our situation is quite a bit different. But we understand, I'm speaking to you, we understand that this is also our task where we are. And this is not just this is a task for all of us together, and urgent for us. I think that the other thing that I would like to say is that it is critical to link this story of who we are with our Christian narrative. It is not just a civil narrative, but it is central and essential to what we feel our story is about. And so the things that I have said, and so we are, number one, we are creating a new narrative in the face of the fear and disintegration that we have, that we are experiencing now in these images. And number two, that children have agency in this narrative. It's not something that's just done to them or for them. It is something that they are a part of in the reweaving of the story of who we are. And finally, that it is a part of the Christian narrative. I would close my reflections by saying that when indigenous people heard the story of Jesus, they responded to it very positively. Those who were Christian and those who were not Christian. That might surprise you, but the Christian story has hope even for those who find the church a bad place to be. And so that narrative has captured the mind of those who can still hope. and those who are fighting for hope in the midst of so much difficulty and so much evidence to the contrary. So I want to say we live in that hope, and the ghost dancers who danced all across Turtle Island, from what is now called the United States to what is now called Canada, they believed that Jesus was going to come back and that he was going to make this place into something new. That was their hope, and it's still our hope today. I think that we must weave that together with the story of who children are on this land today. And thank you very much.
No, it is us who thank you, Mark. Thank you for that very much.